Hello podcasters, welcome to another episode of Living History. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. Gee, hasn't it gotten cold lately? Winter has descended on us very quickly, it seems. It's really good weather for getting a hot drink, sitting in front of a fire and reading a good book, or indeed listening to an interesting podcast. So hopefully during these cold winter months, you'll be tuning into Living History to hear some very interesting chapters of history we've got coming up. So thank you for joining me on what is a wonderful journey through the pages of history. Today, Peter Fitzsimons. Now, Peter Fitzsimons needs no introduction, so I will go ahead and introduce him. Peter has sold hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies of his book, but he's a controversial character. He's copped a lot of criticism for this balance between academic history and the popular history that he likes to write. And he makes no apologies for that. Peter is very upfront about the fact that he is not an academic historian. He likes to tell a good story. He likes to make the history live and breathe in his words. So, love him or hate him, he has sold more books on history than any other Australian. And it was important to sit down and catch up with him at this time with his new book on Hamel coming out, to talk to him about it, about his attitude to history, about the criticism that he receives about his books, but also where he feels his books place in Australian history and in the future of our understanding of the Anzac legend. So his latest book that's come out is the fourth book he's recently written about the First World War. It's called Monash's Masterpiece, the 93 Minutes That Changed the World. So rather a grand title about the Battle of Le Hamel. But it's an interesting book and he's an interesting character. We had a really good catch up, quite a freewheeling conversation. We covered a lot of subjects, but I think you'll really enjoy it. So please join me for this very interesting conversation with Peter Fitzsimons.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terror attack.
This was their finest hour.
Peter, thank you for joining us on Living History. I mean, you've played a big part in, I think, Australia's remembrance of war history in recent years. But we're going to talk about Hamel in your latest book. But before we do that, let's go back. Let's go right back. I mean, even as a child, schoolboy, was history something that was important to you back then?
Well, this is going to sound stylised, quid pro quo, but thank you in turn, Matt, because you've been very kind to me over my World War I books, because I know you know it 10 times better than I know it, and you know it on the ground, which is one of the key things. To go to a hill, a faded trench, a small bunker, and go, this happened here, that happened there, and to try to bring it to life. So I do thank you for your help with me over the years. Look, growing up, my parents were the age of the grandparents of my friends. So my father conceived me when he was 45, Mum was 41, I was the youngest of 7 children, and both had served in the Second World War. So growing up in the 60s or 70s, the Second World War was, I wouldn't say it was a subject of constant conversation, but it wasn't that long ago. And the people that visited the house were very frequently Mum and Dad's war friends. And so I suppose I took wartime conversation with my mother's milk in that sense. I heard all about Churchill and I heard all about John Curtin. And I was particularly imbued with the Second World War. And in 1999, 2000, I perchance wrote a book on Nancy Wake. And of all the books that I do, I want to make $1 million, just on principle. I want them to sell big. The only exception to that rule was the book I did on Nancy Wake. I just thought, look, it's not going to sell at all, but it will please the spirit of my late parents who served in the Second World War. I wrote the book, launched it, to my amazement, to Nancy's amazement, to my publisher's amazement, to the publishing industry's amazement. The book sold 200,000 copies. And my sister said to me, it was like having a conversation with our father, that language. So I suppose that focused me on Second World War stuff, people are fascinated by this stuff, and I'm fascinated by this stuff. And so after that, I did Kokoda, and that did 300,000 copies, and Tobruk 175,000 copies, and I shouldn't be quantifying it, but I'd say that as a indication of the level of interest there was. And while I was doing Second World War stuff and was fascinated by it, First World War stuff, it was a hazy no man's land. One of the things I've often said about our obsession with one particular part of our history is that if you were to take all of Australia's combined military knowledge of Australia's military past, 95% of it starts at dawn on the 25th of April 1915 and fades by sundown, because we tell that story of Gallipoli over and over and over again, and there's just not a lot of room for a lot else. But the more I went into it, so I wrote a book on Gallipoli 4 years ago, and I was fascinated by it and appalled by it. I was appalled by what put us there, the callousness. But so even while I was doing Gallipoli, and I've got a good grasp of Nancy Wake, of course, and I've got a good grasp of Kokoda and Tobruk, I get a bit hazy on other stuff. So what I do, as we were talking before the tapes rolled, I get deep, narrow knowledge. I'm not a proper historian, understands the entire scope of the tableau against which they're writing, and I don't. I get enough to know the context of the story I'm writing about, and I burrow in and I send researchers to burrow even deeper to get the info, to bring it to life. But while I was doing Gallipoli, and I'd done the other books, Western Front, geez, put a gun to my head. What happened there? Geez, I think we lost a lot of blokes. Whereabouts was Western Front? Oh, somewhere up there, North France, I think, something like that. But I mean, after 2 or 3 sentences, detailed knowledge would just run out. But then you go into the story of Fromelles and Pozières, and I can't remember where the idea of doing Fromelles and Pozières came. It might have been suggested by one of my readers, which is often the case. They say, have a look at this, and you have a look at it, and you go, wow. And initially it was Fromelles, but then Pozières, which started 3 days later. And again, keeping me awake at night, when you get into it, Fromelles, you bastards, you what? You fuckers. You send 7,000 Australian soldiers over the top as far as 400 yards, straight at a German bunker. It's got these guns that fire 600 bullets a minute. And again, that sort of stuff scarifies me, and that famous story. And Charles Bean, I've been in touch with his grandchildren because I have to, get them to sign off on copyright and so forth. I'm a huge admirer of the work done by Charles Bean, and I say this with the greatest respect. What I most admire is his factual nature. If Bean said it happened, you can just about put it in the bank. He's the guy you go back to. But what I say with great respect, he's not necessarily the most evocative of writers to bring it all to life. There's an exception to that in his description of the Battle of Pozières, where he talks about heading out into no man's land from memory, 5th of August 1916. And you remember the passage where he talks about what it's like to be under shell fire and the searing, scything shrapnel screaming all around me. And it's about 57 words, but suddenly for me it's the high point of Bean, where he brings it to life. And his description of Pozières again really got me interested in that story. And what also fascinates me about Bean is he goes away, and Ross Coulthart, who I'm sure you know, now recently of Channel 9, but he's also written quite a few books, one very good book on Charles Bean. But he talks about, and I totally agree, that in the works of Bean, you see somebody who started out as more British than the British, who finishes the war as more Australians than the Australian. And I don't say he was a Republican, but I say that he could see up front that he was really for the loyal sons of Great Britain going off to save Great Britain, and had an assumption of British superiority of both arms, leadership and soldiers, and sees it close up and comes away convinced that Australian generals were just as good, Australian soldiers were better, Australian arms were strong, with the exception, which I guess leads us into Le Hamel, where Bean and Keith Murdoch worked hard to stop Sir John Monash, becoming the Australian leader of Australian troops. And that's a fair part of my Hamel book. It's fascinating, all that stuff.
You're obviously very passionate about it. And where do you think your books fit in this whole... Like, a lot of people are reading your books, you know? Hundreds of thousands, millions of Australians have read your books.
And they're sometimes bitterly criticised, but look, you know...
Well, we'll get to that as well.
That's fine. That's
too.
fine.
But where do you think that the books by Fitzsimons, where do they fit in the whole legacy of the Anzacs, our whole remembrance of this history?
Look, I get very snaky when people say, sometimes people who haven't read them say they glorify war, because they don't glorify war. What I'm most keen on is to highlight the insanity of war, of what happened. And I'm, again, a seminal moment in my life in writing about this stuff. When I was 24, 23 years old, I was living just south of Venice playing rugby for the Rovigo Rugby Club. There came a day when there was a 2-week break, must have been around Christmas of 1985, and I had a little Fiat 127, and I drove through the Iron Curtain. I had 30 hours visa to get through Bulgaria, got to Istanbul, parked the car, went to sleep in the lodge, looked out the following morning to see a man walking a bear on a leash. I thought, I'm home, and then drove down to Gallipoli. And, you know, I suppose in those days, visitors to Gallipoli were fairly rare. And I drove down to Gallipoli. It wasn't anywhere near Anzac Day. I walked around, particularly the thing that really hit me was Lone Pine Cemetery. And in those days, and you'll know the story better than me, but I think if you lost a son in battle, you had the right to was it 42 words on the epitaph, on the tombstone. It was a particular number of words. You've lost your son, give us your 42 words. And most of them were, here lies John Philip Laval, late of Gundagai, beloved son of da-da-da-da, and may he rest in the hands of Jesus. Next one, here's Eric Alabab, and in the hands of God may he rest. Anyway, I keep walking along all of these things until I get to one which I will never forget and have never been able to find since, but it was there and I saw it. And it said, here lies John Edgar Abbott, died in a foreign field. And for what? And it was stunning because it was a slap in the face to what the hell was Gallipoli about? What the hell was he doing there? And now he's dead in a foreign field. And for what? And I've been back to Lone Pine 3 times, and every time I go, I take a new section of the cemetery because I want to find that again because it really made a big impression upon me. So in terms of, you know, where my stuff fits, ideally where my stuff fits is to bring it to life, to not necessarily, again, something that really got me was 3 or 4 years ago, must have been 5 years ago now, I did a book on Ned Kelly. I'm being interviewed by Neil Mitchell on 3AW, and somebody called up and said, I'm a policeman with the Victorian Police Force. How dare you? I said, what? He said, how dare you glorifying this cop killer Ned Kelly? And I said, and I meant it, I am doing no such thing. I am saying, mate, this is what fucking happened, okay? I'm not on the side of Ned Kelly. I certainly am on the side of the police, but this is what happened. And the thing that most thrilled me in the response to Ned Kelly was the division of the people who said, what a bastard he was, or what a great man he was, who came to different conclusions. And my best definition of what I like, the guy that played Ned Kelly and still does for 25 years in Beechworth Court, I said, well, what do you make of Ned Kelly? And he'd read every bit of literature there was, and he said he's somewhere between a villainous hero and a heroic villain, and that's the best definition I've heard of him. But in terms of criticisms, there was one historian who wrote a review for The Age, and his opening line was it was something like, the opening line was, this wonderful book has more emotional resonance than Peter Carey's book on the killing. Okay, you bloody beauty, you know, his book won the Booker Prize, and he's saying my book has more emotional resonance. And then he goes on, however, and he had a particular caveat, and the caveat was, and these are not his words, but it boiled down to, however, Fitzsimons makes shit up. And he gave an example of the massacre of Stringy Bar Creek, which again, from memory, I think October of 1878, but there were 4 police who'd gone into Stringy Bark to find the Kelly gang. 2 had gone out on patrol, 2 were left behind. And by my account, was what happened. Kelly is the only one holding the rifle with the 3 of the Kelly gang behind, and they break from deep cover. They could have shot the 2 policemen dead. They didn't. They break from deep cover and they say, throw down your weapons. And one of them throws down the only weapon he has, which is a silver teaspoon, which is a teaspoon. He puts it in his cup. The other one, Constable Lonigan, goes for his gun. Kelly, from 40 yards out, fires at him, shoots him dead, goes down and looks upon him to see who it is he's just killed, and realises it's the same fellow who 5 years previously, when Kelly was 19 years old, he'd fought with 5 policemen for 30 minutes who'd been trying to arrest him, and the only way that Ned Kelly could be subdued was Constable Lonigan that pulled down his pants and gripped him by the testicles. And by my account, Kelly looks down upon him, realises it is the same one who's gripped him by the balls, and realises it's him, and realises that the pain he's had in his testicles for the last 5 years has disappeared. So this particular historian said, more emotional resonance than Peter Carey's book, but Fitzsimons makes shit up. Here's this great anecdote. It's a fabulous anecdote, but there's no proof. Answer. Actually, if you go to page 3, top right-hand corner, 5th of August, 1880, in the second last interview that Ned Kelly ever gave, he said, and I realised that this was the same constable who'd gripped me in the most cowardly and disgusting manner, and the pain that I had had in my nether regions at that point disappeared, blah, blah, blah. And the historian was very apologetic. I said, please don't apologise. It's fine. You've said terrific stuff. However, if you could, just retract, because I don't make shit up. Those sort of anecdotes, they're staggering. And if I put a footnote on every one of those anecdotes, instead of having 2,000 footnotes in my books, they'd have 5,000 footnotes. I mean, it's a blizzard of footnotes, although it's interesting to me. In terms of, I'll have to have a look. With Nancy Wake, I must have had a few footnotes, but it wasn't really an academic exercise. These days, the amount of scholarship that goes into my stuff is staggering and very expensive and very bloody good. On the book that I'm doing now, Mutiny on the Bounty, I've got 3 researchers going pretty much full time. One of them's in Mexico at the moment, which is fantastic. Dr. Libby Effany, because she gets it. I send it to her at 10:45 at night, with 136 queries, which will be what will go out tonight. Particular footnotes, particular facts. Can you check this? Can you do that? Can you find the original document on whatever? And tomorrow morning at 7 a.m, she'll give me back 30 or 40 of them in the first few chapters, and she'll keep it from 7, and then at 9 or 10, the rest of it comes back. And, I said to my publisher today, at the moment, my manuscript on Mutiny on the Bounty, which is just about done, but it's being worked on between all of us about 36 hours a day, checking, finding new material, cutting back. And the amount of effort and energy that goes into the books I'm doing now is by a factor of 20. I mean, I did Nancy Wake in the corner over there. I went up to interview Nancy. I went to the Herald and got the Nancy Wake file out, which was about 3 inches thick. I photocopied every article that ever been on her. I think I interviewed Nancy for 30 hours. Sadly, I've only got 1 hour of those tapes left somewhere. But in terms of serious scholarship, it just wasn't there. Even Kokoda and Tobruk, they had more scholarship in them, but nothing like what I put in now.
So how do you feel then? I mean, you've copped your fair share of criticism regarding the history versus yarn side of your books. How do you feel when you put your blood, sweat and tears into it and then you get those reactions?
I want everybody every exercise you do in this life, you learn things. And the one thing I learnt from the man who's just become the Governor of Western Australia, Kim Christian Beazley, I wrote his biography in 1998. And at one point with Kim, who I love as a man, he's a terrific man, and I said to Kim, Jesus, how do you get through the day when I pick up the Oz or the Telegraph or whatever and there are 5 articles attacking you every day? And he said, I don't read them. And I thought, genius, absolute genius. And there was Nancy Wake got very well reviewed. But there was an exception, and where would that exception be? Why, my own newspaper, of course, because the Herald, we pride ourselves, we catch and kill our own. There was about 6 paragraphs by a reviewer who'll remain nameless. Let's just call her Deborah Adelaide. And she wrote a review. I've never met Deborah Adelaide. I'm sure she's a very fine operator, but I'll never forget that review. And it was there's been 3 biographies of Nancy Wake. One was done in 1956. One was done by Nancy Wake herself, and this one by Peter Fitzsimons. Far and away the best of them is Nancy Wake's. And I've got to say, when I do meet Deborah Adelaide, I want to say, seriously, have you read all 3 of them? Nobody who reads all 3. Braddon's book was fabulous, and I'm very careful to credit him in my intros of saying, my work owes his work. He's put hundreds of hours back in the 1950s into Nancy Wake, and I'd modernised the story and told it in my own fashion, and told I suppose modern researching techniques to widen it and the rest of it. But for the time when Braddon wrote it, it was as good as it gets. And then Deborah Adelaide said this: the subject is far deeper than her, something like that. The subject is far deeper than the author allows to be. And I've got this in me. I mean, I know I should let it go, but 20 years later I want to say, oh, really? Oh, really? She's a lot deeper, is she, than I let her be? Do tell me your insights, because I want to know, because I read every word there is that's done on her. I've talked to her for 30 hours. I've talked to the 5 surviving friends she's got, both here and in France. I've been there. But anyway, not that I'm bitter. But that taught me that my absurd overreaction to that. Basically, these days, when I see reviews, I get the tenor of them, and if they're bad enough, couldn't be bothered. I don't, basically, no joke, the absolute truth of it is, I don't want to lose half a day of writing. I don't want to lose a day. I don't want the emotional baggage. But I do treasure one where it was my Gallipoli book. And Germaine Greer reviewed it for the Times of London. So Alison Urquhart, who was then my publisher at Random, said, "Oh, look, Germaine Greer's reviewed you for the Times. I said, here's a copy." And I said, "Oh,
see, that's got to be a daunting call to receive."
Yeah, and this will be good. So I go into it, and I see opening paragraph, appalling, disgrace, blah blah blah, and I'm just about to shut it down when I can't help but see the window. You have the breakout quote. And the breakout quote hit me between the eyes before I could shut it down. And the breakout quote was, "This is how an historian would write if he was on ecstasy." And I mean, one of Germaine's in the opening 2 or 3 pars, and I like Germaine Greer, but and I've met her quite a few times, but in part of the criticism that I did read before I shut it down, it was something like about how many Indian soldiers had died at Gallipoli and how their story was a great better than Australia's story. To which the answer is again, Germaine, if I was writing for the Indian market about Indians at Gallipoli, then I would I'd go into the Indian story. But this doesn't pretend to be anything other than a story about Australians at Gallipoli. But anyway, look, I don't lose. I lose less time on it now than energy on it, and I'm more bemused by it than there was one particular savage reviewer way back when, and I won't go into it because I don't want to start a public war. But he wrote a vicious review, and those was in the days when I was still reading it, and I went, Jesus. So I went to got the book that he'd got out. And it was one of those academic texts that I defy anybody that wasn't born and raised on that stuff to know it backwards and forwards, to enjoy that book. I mean, I had a go. I couldn't get 10 pages into it. I just didn't understand it. Because I had no context whatsoever. So for me, I sort of use my ignorance as a tool. If I'm not a critic of academics at all. I think academics do fabulous work, and I'm proud to be the presiding pro-chancellor at Sydney University. I've been on the Senate for 8 years, and one of my lines when I hand out degrees, I said, "Well, look, you to whom I've just given doctorates and master's degrees, fabulous, but you're not my people. My people are you poor bastards up the back who've just got here by the hairs of your chinny chin chin. My stuff doesn't pretend to be academic. What I want to do is I want to bring the story to life. And I guess I've used, new techniques to do it, differing techniques. And a lot of historians, led by the late, great Neil MacDonald, who only died 3 weeks ago, have been very kind to me. Professor John Maloney has been very good to me. A lot of historians have been. David Day, Australia's foremost political biographer, has been very good to me. So a lot of them have been very good to me. But I say this, I think sometimes academic texts can stray into the territory whereby they want to say, you think you know about it and you think you know big words, I'll show you big words, I'll show you oblique angles, try fucking this. Whereas my approach is quite different. I go in and I say to myself, look, I'm reasonably well educated, I've been around, but the truth of it is when I started writing military books, I was not sure how many soldiers were in a division, how many were in a company, a platoon, a brigade, all that. And my reasoning was, well, look, if I don't know, then a fair chance that my readers don't know, so I make sure I build it into my account. Now, as a matter of interest, Matt, do you know in maritime stuff, do you know what a PINACRE is? Pinnaker?
I have no idea.
Me neither. But in all of the bounty literature, there's references to the pinnaker, which is basically a small boat. And one of the things I've just in the last day or two said, well, I don't want pinnakers in my book on the bounty because I don't know what a pinnaker is, and if I don't know what a pinnaker is, most of them I'll make it a small boat. And so, I think it was Mark Twain who said the famous line from Mark Twain, why should I use the word metropolis when for the same price I can use the word city? And it was a really interesting point.
Let's talk about the new book, Hamel, which is coming out shortly. I think it's fair to say this is the fourth book in your trilogy about the First World War. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
How did that come about? Especially since, I spoke to you about this time and you were saying that you felt you'd said everything there was to say about the First World War between Gallipoli, Fromelles...
Not everything there is to say, but everything I cared to say.
Okay.
And you've been to Hamel, I would guess, 25 times, and you will be very familiar with the words of the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. And it's up on the wall at Le Hamel. And the line that I just love, tomorrow, because the Battle of Hamel was on the 4th. He found out about it on the morning of the 4th. He said to his secretary right there, clear the decks, I'm going up there. And I think it was on the 7th, certainly within 2 or 3 days. He asked to address the Australians, and they got the 4th Brigade out of the trenches, and they form up muddy before the French Prime Minister. And he says words to this effect. He says, tomorrow I will return to my people. I will tell my people I have seen the Australians. I have looked into their eyes. When you came here 4 years ago, we knew that you would fight. Or in fact, 2 years ago, when you came here 2 years ago, we knew you would fight for our nation because we knew what you'd achieved in your own country, that you would fight for our children and for liberty. We had no idea. You have astonished a continent. Wow. Just wow. What extraordinary words. What moving words. And I read those words on one of my trips because Villers-Bretonneux is a hop, skip and a jump. What am I looking for? Hop, step and a jump. Hop, skip and a jump, one of those. Only away from it, 2 kilometres away. So I'd been to Hamel a couple of times and I saw those words and I thought, geez, that's really something. Of all the speeches made in the First World War, they're the ones that get me. What was behind him saying those words? And so you get into the Battle of Le Hamel. And my elder brother David, who I'm 56 years old, he's nudging 70. And he's, oddly enough, he's a wide reader. He was the first one that told me about Mawson, what a good story it was. And I listened to him tell the story and I thought, geez, that's a good story. He was the first one that told me, well, he told me some of the details of some of the stuff from Kingsford Smith that, really inspired me. He's an engineer, and he was the one that told me about the Battle of Le Hamel and how extraordinary Sir John Monash was as an engineer. So my brother's an engineer. He identifies with Monash as an engineer of warfare was not over the top, boys. It was a logistical problem. And what fascinated me about the Battle of Le Hamel, even though it was not a big battle, it was the prototype for the rest of the war. They put, on the Allied side, on the strength of it, they put Monash basically in charge of the spearhead that, the final 100 days, that was John Monash. That was our people. And in terms of, again, I do this in speeches. I talk about after dinner speeches, if the subject comes up of wartime. And I say, well, we Australians are an extraordinary bunch when it comes to our Day of Military Remembrance, because if you go to the Second World War and you look what Diggers did after Germany invades Poland, goes through the Low Countries, knocks over every country in Europe till they get to Africa, every opponent, every enemy in Europe, till they get to Africa, and they keep going and knock them over, till they get to the Australians at Tobruk, who stopped them. First at the Battle of Macquarie on the 8th of April, then the 13th of April 41, and then they stopped them 4 times that year under General Sir Leslie Morshead. Then you go to Kokoda and the Japanese, 7th of December 41. They're into the Philippines 12 hours later, into Indochina, down through the Malayan Peninsula, get to Singapore, knock them over. They keep going. Nothing can stop them until they get to the Australians at Milne Bay and Kokoda, and they stop them. Land Army, first time they stopped. So the point I make in speeches is, it is extraordinary that on our military record, it wasn't Steven Spielberg or Tom Hanks or Saving Private Ryan or John Wayne or any of them that were the first to stop the Japanese and the first to stop the Germans in that Second World War. It was our blokes. And when you've been to Kokoda and when you've been to Tobruk and you see the fly-blown, wind-swept, dry, horrible environment of Tobruk, to think that those same blokes who could be the first to stop the Germans there in that god-awful desert, and it's a god-awful desert, and then these same blokes take them out of that, they stop the Germans, and then these same ones stop the Japanese in the jungles of New Guinea. It is unbelievable. The line that I use in speeches, I say, but when it comes the Day of Military Remembrance, do we undo our top 3 buttons to show off our hairy chests, beat our hairy chests and say, what about us? That was our blokes. We stopped the Germans, we stopped the Japanese. Or do we say what we actually say? Yeah, I suppose we did stop the Germans first. Geez, I suppose we stopped the Japanese first. Did we ever tell you about the time we got flogged by the Turks? And I say that with great respect to those who achieved extraordinary things in Gallipoli. But my point is, we keep going back, as I said it earlier, we just keep going back to that story again and again and again, to the exclusion of all else. And for me, with Hamel, that story deserves to be better known. Sir John Monash deserves to be better known. You and I are met at a time when the name Monash is in the news, because there is the Monash Forum, been established by several parliamentarians, saying, if Monash was here, Monash would want more coal, would take moribund power stations at a time of global warming and say, yeah, whack it in there. And I believe it is a fundamental misreading of Monash, because Monash was first and foremost, he was a man of science, he was an engineer, but first and foremost, he was an innovator. And what Monash did when finally, against terrible anti-Semitism, it has to be said, finally, this revolutionary idea comes up in 1918. Well, it had been bubbling for a while, but this revolutionary idea comes up. You know what? These are Australian soldiers fighting in this war. What do you reckon we put an Australian in charge? What? You can't have an Australian in charge of Australian soldiers. Anyway, the idea took hold, and finally, against terrible anti-Semitism, both from within and without Australian shores, Monash took over. And Monash's first point was, listen, we're not doing it in the old way. We're not saying the enemy's got 5,000 soldiers, so we'll get 7,000 soldiers and we'll just charge forward and hope we've got 2,000 soldiers left over. He treated it as an engineering problem, and he was a great believer early on in the power of tanks. Now, tanks had been badly derided. Was it November 1917, the first time they'd been used at Bullecourt, and there'd been a disaster because they hadn't arrived in time, and the Australians had been slaughtered.
April, that was? Yeah, April 1917, yeah.
I was about to say April 1917. And he was insistent, and he came up with this plan, and it wasn't again, this was first explained to me by my brother, but he wasn't, this is the plan, just do it. The military manner was, I'm the general, this is the plan, follow your orders. Monash came up with the bones of a plan, but then put around the table the men from the Air Force, the men from the artillery, the men from the tank division, the men from the infantry, and they worked the plan and he wanted, come up with different ways. How are we going to move the supplies forward? What time are we going to attack? What angle are we going to attack from? How are we going to use the tanks? How are we going to get the tanks, which are very noisy beasts, far enough forward that the Germans won't know that we're here? And through this sheer genius, again from memory, he wrote the bones of the plan on the night, I think, of the 19th, 20th of June, for a plan that was going to take place 2 weeks later, the 4th of July, first time that Americans were used in that war. Again, to believe all the World War I movies, you'd think the Americans did the whole thing. They didn't strike a blow in anger, really, until the 4th of July, and it was all over by the 11th of November, 1918. So they're only there for the last few months of the war. That had a few defensive operations beforehand, but this was the first time they'd been used in attack. But the actual plan that was come up, why I've called it Monash's masterpiece, here's how we're going to do it. These positions are defended by the Germans. Well, what can we do? What can we do to blow them apart? We're going to need them to really not know what's going on. So we'll attack in the middle of the night. What time in the middle of the night? Well, we're going to have to attack at a time that the rising sun silhouettes them against the landscape for our blokes to shoot at, but our blokes will be coming out of the darkness. So test it and test it and test it. And it came up with 10 past 3 a.m. that will begin the initials of the attack. I think it was 3:03 a.m. They'll first go forward at 3:10 a.m. How are we going to get the Germans to be out of sorts? Well, the first thing is they'll be in the middle of the night. Second thing was we want them to wear gas masks. How are we going to do that? Well, for the 2 weeks leading up to the attack, we'll drop artillery on their noggins every night at 3 a.m. with the shells. We'll have gas, and we'll teach them that when the shells fall upon them at 3 a.m, you better put your gas masks on quick. And so they do that for 2 weeks. And so, like Pavlov's dogs, come the actual attack, they don't have the gas amongst it, but the Germans have got their gas masks on. So they're hampered to fire. They don't quite know what's going on. How are we going to get the tanks to come far enough forward without working out they're there? We'll get planes to roar in overhead, just up beyond the level of their ack-ack, but noisy enough to drown the force of the tanks. We'll use a creeping barrage, and a highly sophisticated creeping barrage, so that as our blokes go forward, the barrage moves just ahead of them. And it was just this extraordinary plan that he came up with the help of many others, and worked out how to do it. And instead of, if you compare it with the Battle of Pozieres, again, you'll know the information, we lost 7,000 men killed in the space of 6 weeks. Am I right in saying for an advance of about 2 miles?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the Battle of Hamel, I think they went forward about a mile, but Monash had a very restricted, we're not just going to keep going till we run out of gas. This is the blue line. I want you to get there and dig in, and we only lost 300 men killed. And so, prior to Monash, from Mel, we lost 1,900 killed, didn't gain a yard. Pozieres, good night, only several hundred killed, and we made 50 yards. Suddenly, Monash, doing it as an engineer does it, treating it as a logistical problem. How do you apply maximum firepower, maximum force to their weakest point, break through? How do we do that as an engineering exercise, almost a dispassionate engineering exercise? Monash came up with the plan, and that effectively became the model that so many of the others followed.
Do you think we remember Monash well enough in Australia today?
I think that Monash is like what Kokoda used to be. Kokoda, New Guinea, isn't it? Something up there. But then when people realise, more and more people know about Kokoda, and I think with Monash, we know Monash University is very well known. The electorate of Monash. Monash is a name that resonates in Australian life. Most people don't know what he did, what he was about, but he was an extraordinary man and a great man.
This has been really wonderful insight, Peter, and I'm very appreciative of your time. Just to finish up, you have delved into history for so long now. For decades you've been delving into this history. In your opinion, what lessons can we learn from history? And what lessons should we learn that we don't?
I think the primary, again, maybe I'm putting my Republican chair hat on, we got to depend on ourselves. The lesson from our military history is we're not going to build up enough frequent fighter points for great powers that they'll automatically come to our aid and rely upon them for our security. I mean, when I did the bio of Kim Beazley, that was really opened my eyes to defensive strategy. That was Kim's thing. I think his when he was at Oxford, which was 1972, his thesis was superpower strategy in the Indian Ocean, 1956 to 90. But to understand that, I had to get my head around Australia's military history. And, you know, when you go into that First World War, Andrew Fisher, who was about to become our Prime Minister, said, "We will fight for Great Britain to the last man and the last shilling." When Menzies, declared war in 1939, he said, "It's my melancholy duty to inform you that Great Britain is at war, therefore Australia is at war." And I never understood until recently that was not necessarily just a moral imperative, a legal imperative. His view was Great Britain, the mother country, is at war, therefore we're the sons and daughters of Great Britain, therefore we're at war. And for me, the lessons from all of this is we've got to be our own people, we've got to be in charge of our own destiny, we've fundamentally got to be able to defend ourselves, and we've also got to comport ourselves in a manner that the others, our potential enemies, don't want to attack us.
Peter, it's been very fascinating. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. The new book, Monash's masterpiece, The Battle of Le Hamel, is out now. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you for having me. I've had a lovely time.